everybody. This is Dr. Dan, and this is week 11 of History 3380, History of Business and Technology in the U.S. And this week, this is the amazing Electrification desktop lecture. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about my new book, When They Hid the Fire. And you're going to read chapters 6 and 7. And I've made copies of those chapters, and they're out there on the class website for you. And we have some learning objectives that I want to get to this week. These are the things you need to know after this week's class. And they're all important. You know, electricity is such a major technological change that affected society. I don't think in the history of this country there's been a bigger one. This sort of new form of energy changed the way people lived, it changed the way people shopped, and it also changed the way that people thought about the environment. So these are all important things to learn about. Now, our first learning objective for this week is to be able to identify when electrification occurred in this country. And the right answer is between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. You know, right now we've been studying big business and capitalism in this progressive era, that same time frame. And that's the same time electrification began to be adopted in the country. So, you know, the first large-scale generation plant was built in 1882 in Manhattan on Pearl Street by Thomas Edison. And the location of that plant is really no mistake because one of Edison's major investors was J.P. Morgan, and his offices were really near that plant. So if your investor is giving you a lot of money to come up with a new system that you've talked a lot about and really kind of bragged a lot about, you're going to build your generation plant really close to his offices so they could be lit up first. So that's why Thomas Edison started there, because he was near J.P. Morgan, who put a lot of money into this system, promising, big returns. So 1882 is really the first large-scale plant. And for someone like a farmer in Ohio, out in rural Ohio, it may not have been until the 1930s that they got power. So understand that time frame between the late 1800s and the early 1900s as far as the deployment of electricity is concerned. The second learning objective for this week, and it's an important one, is to be able to explain why electricity is a secondary energy source. Quite simply, that means that electricity doesn't live on its own. It needs a primary energy source to be generated, whether that's coal or fracked natural gas or nuclear power, which heats water and makes steam to turn generators, or it could be solar panels or wind-driven power. But I think that, we're all kind of tricked. We look at our cell phone, right? And, this takes about 5 pounds of coal a year to run if you're in Ohio, or fracked natural gas. So, the other day a student was complaining to me that his cell phone battery wasn't lasting long enough. And it's like, dude, you got to understand that it's not just your cell phone battery, but there's like guys in mines digging coal out or blasting the tops of mountains off to get coal to put on a train to ship all the way up here to Ohio, to run your iPhone. And so, the battery might seem like a big deal, but really there's a lot more to it than that. So that's what a secondary source of power is. It's something that requires another source of power to be made. I think that most people think electricity comes from the wall outlet, and really there's a lot of stuff that has to happen on the other side of the wall outlet for us to get power. And that leads us into our third learning objective for this week, be able to explain why the public began to see electricity as a standalone energy source. The whole point of the title of this book, When They Hid the Fire, was that as power generation moved away from the city center or moved away from where we live, we tended to forget about it. Those high tension or high voltage wires that you'll see in fields, or the wires that are on the side of the road, tend to blend into the landscape for us. We're so used to them. So, the public began to perceive electricity as something that was magical, or at least they didn't think about where it came from at all. So in all of these current debates about climate change, global warming, all that sort of stuff, it's hard for us to think about that on a day-to-day basis because we really don't pay attention to where the power comes from. And so this learning objective, understanding why society began to see electricity as a standalone power source, is because this infrastructure, the energy grid, really became invisible to us. And it's an important part of U.S. history that we don't often think about. And I think it's important because I think it helps us understand why climate change science isn't something that everyone buys into. So make sure you understand that learning objective. Our fourth learning objective for the week is to know how electrification drove consumerism in this country. And, there's two answers to that. A lot of the large retail stores, whether it was Fields or Macy's or those types of stores, they couldn't have existed in their current form without illumination, electric light, and electric signage that allowed them to stay open longer and really drove this consumer movement and turned shopping into like a full-time enterprise all night long. So that's a part of it, but probably the more important part of it is that electrical appliances, whether it was the first vacuum cleaners, washing machines, lamps, fans, back in the early 1900s, created this whole new consumer category. And that's really worked into our sort of gadget-crazed consumer society today where, half the stuff we buy you plug into the wall. So this whole new category of consumer goods that runs on electricity, whether it be a television, a radio, what have you, all came about because of electrification. So that's how electricity really affected society from the standpoint of consumerism. Now, lastly, the last thing to understand this week to get out of the reading is why alternate methods of electrical generation never came to fruition early on. Now, there's a story in the book about a rancher named Bosler outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I first learned about this at the University of Wyoming when I was going through the archives there. And Bosler wrote to General Electric way back in the 1900s, and he was asking GE to help him come up with a method to generate electricity via wind. And GE wasn't interested in pursuing this because, well, A, they didn't think it was viable, and B, they really didn't have any financial incentive to do this. Back in the day, back in the early 1900s, moving forward all the way to today, coal is cheap and it's fairly efficient, and the infrastructure for burning coal is already in place. And that's one of the big arguments today. If we require power plants to make their plants run cleaner, it adds expense, it makes coal more expensive. And it's a private enterprise, so keeping your cost of generation low is financial incentive for you to make more power and to be more profitable. Now, things like wind power, solar power have all come down in price, and they're real close to the cost of coal, but we also have the cheap natural gas that's derived from fracking that's driving the market right now. So, there's still not a lot of financial incentive for the big power companies to switch away from things like coal or natural gas. So those are the things you have to know this week. Go ahead and do the reading. You have a little assignment this week that is you have to come up with an argument, whether coal miners' jobs or clean air are more important. And I'm interested in seeing how you handle that. You'll go ahead and write an essay and turn it in on the class website. That's it for this week. Everyone's doing a great job. Keep up the good work, and I'll talk to you again next week. Take care.